All right, so yesterday you started chapter 14 and you read section 1 and answered the questions. So let's go through it a little bit to give you a better understanding of the chapter. It will help you a lot with the application activities for chapter 14 and then also when we get into monetary policy. So let's go ahead and look at economic instability. So the first thing that the section talked about was the business cycle, which is basically how our economy goes up and down. Pretty simple idea. Most of you have noticed that we have our highs with good economic activity, and then, as you might remember, for 2008, we see some downturns. Watching the news today, you really do see the business cycle coming into play, and we'll be looking at that as a way to apply what we're learning to what's going on. Since 1900, our business cycles have been irregular. They're not predictable. The same highs don't occur, the same lows don't occur. So we're just really watching the GDP going up and down. So let's take a look at the different stages. The book gives you two phases of the business cycle, recession, and then I believe it was expansion. Most textbooks that you'll look at and what we'll talk about is really four phases to the business cycle. And if you're looking at the picture, you can see our four. The first phase of the business cycle would be an expansion, which pretty much what it sounds like. The economy is growing and it keeps growing till it hits its peak. You won't know you're at a peak until you're actually on the downturn. So the first phase would be an expansion with a growing GDP. It culminates with a peak, which is the highest point that an economy hits within that cycle. Your book calls the downward direction of our economy a recession. A recession is when the GDP goes down 2 consecutive quarters, so that would be 6 months. I would argue that a better term that you'll see in other books is contraction, where the economy is falling. Just because the economy is falling doesn't necessarily mean we're in a recession, because by definition, in a recession, you have to have the GDP falling 2 consecutive quarters or 6 straight months. When you're in a contraction, though, you might see the economy go down for 3 months, then go up just a little bit, then fall again, where you don't actually hit the 6 months in a row where the GDP is falling. So I would tell you guys that to understand that downward trend of our economy is a contraction, and it is during the contraction that you might find a recession, but you may not necessarily find a recession just because you've got to hit that mandatory requirement of 6 consecutive months. When the economy bottoms out and hits its lowest point, that's the trough. Again, you wouldn't know you were hit the trough until you start expanding again. So the 4 phases for our business cycle, really, we have expansion, peak, contraction, trough. And it's within the contraction that you might find a recession. And needless to say, it's going to be in the trough where you would find a depression. Now, if you are looking at this particular picture, you see the 4 phases that we just talked about, but then you also see something known as a trend line. That would be if our economy grew slow and steady without any peaks or valleys. Okay. We have a really particular definition of a recession, which is GDP falls for 2 consecutive quarters. For depression, we really don't have that kind of a specific definition. Instead, economists look at a depression as a very bad recession. We've only had one depression in our country's history, and that would be the Great Depression that you studied last year. When we're deciding whether or not we're in a depression, we compare them. So we look at, are there large numbers out of work that compare equally to the depression? Are the shortages of goods equal to that which existed in the depression? Is the capacity of the economy or the lack of production about the same as in the Great Depression? And nothing really has compared to the Great Depression. So we've had many, many recessions, but we've only had one depression. To give you an idea of the kind of numbers that you would need to qualify as a Great Depression, let's look at a little bit about the period starting in 1929, then working our way into the 1930s. So GDP will fall from 103 billion to 55 billion. So we'd have to see that kind of a fall of almost what, half. Unemployment up 800%. So it will be interesting as we watch the news to see what happens to our unemployment numbers coming up here. And if you notice, your wages went from 55 cents an hour to only 5 cents an hour. Their banks, if you remember, began to fail. There was no FDIC or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So when folks went to get their money from a bank, as you remember, the banks didn't have the money to give them. And so that led to the banking holiday, and people just lost the money that they had in banks. That's going to change, and we'll look at that in the banking chapter. If we look at what caused the Great Depression, we can narrow it down to a few things. One is the disparity in income within our country. The poor were poor and the rich were rich. The poor didn't have the money to spend in our economy on things that generate jobs, from everyday purchases of groceries and daily goods. The rich had the money, but they really didn't spend it on those average everyday goods that gave people jobs. Instead, they put their money in non-productive activities, things like stock. You buying stock doesn't necessarily give a job to somebody. Buying gold for your portfolio doesn't necessarily create jobs. So the disparity between the rich and the poor. Another problem that caused the Great Depression was easy credit. You might remember this from last year. We had stock being bought on credit or on margin. So people continue to use credit, and eventually you got to pay those bills, and people didn't have that money to pay the bills, and it led to them not being able to purchase pretty much anything else. And then the last cause that we'll look at is the global economic crisis. This is the years between World War I and World War II. And you might remember that we gave a lot of money in the form of loans to Europe, especially Germany, to prop them up. If you remember the Dawes plan. When our economy started to tank, we pulled back our loans from those countries, and then we sent those countries' economies into a nosedive. And because we rely so much on foreign trade, now that these countries didn't have any extra money, they stopped buying things from us, and it continued to make our situation worse and also theirs worse. Since the business cycle, or since World War II, the business cycle, for us, luckily, the recessions definitely are significantly less in time versus an average expansion. So if we look at the unemployment rates and we look at what was going on in the Great Depression versus 2008, which was the Great Recession, our last major recession, you can see they really don't compare in severity. Same thing with the fall of the Dow Jones, which is looking at our stock market. The loss of value of the Dow Jones was significantly worse in the Great Depression. That's the red line, versus 2008, which is your blue line. So it's part of the reason why we don't call 2008 anywhere near a recession, because the numbers don't compare at all to the Great Depression. All right, you had this question on your homework, if you remember the causes of the business cycle. One of the things that causes ups and downs in our economy is the purchase of capital expenditure. When things are going well, businesses put money into capital, which might be a factory or more machinery that produces more so that they can make more money. But then as time starts to slow down, they pull back on production, which causes layoffs and can send us more into a contraction. Another cause would be inventory adjustments, either buying more inventory or cutting in more inventory. If businesses are buying inventory because they feel times are good, they are going to contribute to the expansion. But when they start to see things slow down, they'll cut back, and we'll start to see kind of a pullback on our economy, and the GDP will go down. Third cause would be business innovation and imitation. Businesses, as we know, want to innovate so that they can make more money, and businesses will do that, and they'll force the competition to be able to compete with them. As they're lowering their prices, their competitors will start the process of imitation of what they've done. Eventually, the new product, the new innovation the market becomes saturated, people have the good and they no longer need it. This happened with computers in the computer industry when we had a lot more. You might remember you had Dell, you had your IBM, you had Gateway, and they all were in this industry. But eventually consumers bought and they saturated the market with computers, and then people didn't need more computers, so they pulled back, and we saw a number of those companies go down and some go out of business. The fourth cause of the business cycle are monetary factors. We're going to spend a whole chapter looking at the Federal Reserve and how they can make either money easy to get and we buy and we borrow, or they can make it hard to get where we don't buy and we don't borrow. So we tend to then go into a contraction. The last cause of the business cycle would be external shocks. This might be something like we're experiencing right now with the COVID-19, with the quarantining. We're watching the economy go from one of the strongest economies we've had in decades to this major slowdown. So that's an example of an external shock. The last thing you read about in the chapter is how economists do try to predict the business cycle to try to avoid having a low low. Economists will build economic models. We know how to figure out the GDP. We know we add consumer spending, we add government spending, we add business spending. Then we look at imports and exports where they can break these down and they can look at different indices to see what's happening, what direction are we going, and try to correct the economy as much as possible. So it's one of the things that we have a lot of government economists that work on, and then also large businesses employ economists to try to predict the direction of the economy and try to lessen the impact, because it is normal for the economy to go down, but they just try to lessen how low is that low. So that's our basic information for section 1. Hopefully, as you start going through chapter 14 and watching the news, you'll start to see this connection that will lead to a better understanding as you watch what's going on. All right, so I'll check in later with you guys, and have a good day.